So that's the model I think that you develop in Crack Up Capitalism, this idea that, going small instead of going bigger, going micro, poking in the system rather than global encasing through laws and rules and norms. In your even more recent work, I mean, Hayek's Bastard in particular, other elements of the mutation of neoliberalism seem to appear, right? Because for the neoliberal of the globalist era, the general idea was that capital goods, and to a lesser extent people, should be sort of free to circulate, and that you need some kind of a constitution of liberty to allow this to work without having to deal with governmental, especially national governmental overreach. That was. But then with the mutation, due both to the melancholy created by the end of the Cold War and the new excitement caused by the new possibility of East Asia, other things appear too, which I want to go one by one. The first one is the so-called racially realistic control of migrations and human capital management. The second one is the return of tariffs that we should talk about, and the strategic use of tariffs, certainly a taboo for the globalists, to reorganize trade around bilateral relations rather than big multilateral treaties. Then alternative ways of dealing with monetary inflation, which was also an obsession for neoliberals all along, but this time with a revamping of gold, strange thing, and of course the development of cryptocurrency more recently. And then finally, another thing that is interesting and very striking in Trump is the reinforcement of executive privilege, which of course predates Trump but is pushed to new levels, that seems to be taking the place of the legal encasement that you were talking about in globalism. So the idea is to go through these four transformations. And first, let's start with the hard borders. How did hard borders, but also racial discrimination based on IQ, but also selective natalism became integral parts of the mutating neoliberal regime?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally when people talk about the far right, one of the things they attribute to the far right is belief in the ethno-state, right? The idea that membership in the community should be defined according to some questions of heredity, bloodline, or nation, place of origin. And I think this is partially why the analysis of the far right is often mostly focused on questions of politics and culture rather than questions of economics, because it's seen to be almost an anti-economic logic. It's focused so much on these particularities, either scientifically based or more spiritually based, that supposedly bind a community of fate, as the Germans would call it, a Schicksalsgemeinschaft. What I write about in Hayek's Bastards is that some of the neoliberals and the libertarian-minded ingenues and kind of habitués of the financial world were drawn to hard borders not because they were attracted to some idea of the national essence or the importance of blood and soil, but because they were able to arrive at sort of exclusionary logics through an economic rationale themselves. So Peter Brimelow is the person that I focus in on Hayek's Bastards, who is one of the most famous nativists in the United States, is seen as one of the fathers of what is now the sort of Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller model of purifying the population and radically hardening the borders and reducing the paths to citizenship. Most people would see him as a classic kind of far-right believer in the ethno-state. And yet he arrived at that position through a completely economic lens. His argument was consistent with Milton Friedman's own argument, which is that you can either have a welfare state or open borders, but you can't have both. So if you continue to have a welfare state, then you're going to be drawing in the kind of people who are actually least capable of fending for themselves and are most liable to be parasitic on federal budgets. This was mapped for him onto a kind of hierarchy of cultural abilities and racial characteristics, meaning that he followed the work of IQ bad science to suggest that people from certain parts of the world, because they have lower IQ, have also a shorter time horizon, an inability to plan for the long term, and an inability to be entrepreneurial. Therefore, they were more likely to become welfare dependents. That was the logic drawn on by Richard Lynn, Charles Murray, Peter Brimelow, and in the German case, perhaps the most important intellectual source for the far-right Thilo Sarrazin,
who was a member of the SPD.
Who started out as a member of the SPD and was also even a member of the board of the Bundesbank. So someone coming from a total economic rationality, arriving at an exclusionary hard borders policy on the basis not of a belief in, the Aryan race or the importance of thousands of years of German heritage, but because of the belief in the need to filter out likely welfare dependents based on a racial criteria and filter in likely productive members of society also based on a racial criteria, both mapped onto the bad science of IQ claims that intelligence was the most important indicator and it could help you make a kind of useful first stab at understanding who's going to be a good member of the economy and who's not going to be a good member of the economy. So that hard borders position can be justified on ethno-economic principles as well as ethno-state principles. And more, I think that's the way it's being defended by the sort of hard right neoliberals themselves. Now, there is another strain of this, which is more in the line of Murray Rothbard and the anarcho-capitalist wing of the hard right neoliberal coalition, which believes in hard borders because they believe in the idea of sort of entry by admission. So the idea of private gated communities that require a kind of proper payment to become part of them. Citizenship by investment would be a model of this. This idea of nations by consent, as Murray Rothbard talked about them in the 1990s, would embrace hard borders because it's a way of making sure that people who pay to be part of smaller communities are not being sort of invaded by freeloaders and people who would be otherwise not contributing to the value of the community itself.
So you mentioned Friedman and the use of Friedman, but there's also Hayek. Hayek, who was seen as sort of a Gentile globalist par excellence, but nonetheless, it's using or abusing Hayek through that this kind of re-racializing wing will come to the fore, and in fact, eventually become mainstreamed in a neoliberal circle. So,
I could talk about that.
Let's talk about
Sure.
Yeah.
So this is very interesting, right? Because Mises and Hayek, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek are both sort of the children of the Habsburg Empire. And one thing about the Habsburg Empire was that it was the biggest free trade zone in Europe when it existed, in which there was total free mobility of movement for capital goods and labor. The riddle that was sort of solved within the Habsburg Empire, according to von Mises, is that you had sort of one big economic unity, but then you also had ways to make people satisfied in terms of national self-determination. So if you had enough people of one language group, you could get money from the government to start up your own school. There was representation of different national groups within the Habsburg Empire, a kind of unity and diversity. And one of the story of globalists, in a way, is to the attempt to scale that up to the level of the world. So Mises himself was actually kind of a maximalist in terms of the free movement of labor. However, he, like Hayek, sort of conceded that there were all kinds of reasons of cultural mindset and cultural values that made it hard for people to accept the sudden arrival of a lot of people of a different racial background, ethnic background. I wrote an article about this with the title, Perfect Capitalism, Imperfect Humans, because they sort of left the door open for exclusion based on race and culture, not because of their economic theory, but as a kind of acceptance of the limits of human adaptability. So what began for Hayek as a kind of a footnote or an exception, he defended Margaret Thatcher's nativism on these grounds. People are not ready for it. It would be nice if they were, but they're not. Has then become the basis for more radical nativist neoliberals of saying this is an absolute rule. It's not an exception, something that may transform with time, but it's a starting point and also an end point. That racial homogeneity is actually a plus for the reduction of the kind of transaction costs within an economy. And we shouldn't accept this as a transitional period towards a future in which labor will be free and we will all live in a grand multiracial commonwealth underneath the sign of economic freedom, but that actually it's more like the long-term permanent arrangement that we should create small racially homogeneous spaces because those tend to be more protective of the economic freedom principles we believe in. South Africa is a great example of this logic in action. In the 1980s, before Nelson Mandela was, the end story of South Africa, the bestseller in political terms, it was written by a white libertarian named Leon Lowe with the support of the Charles Koch Foundation. And his argument was not a rainbow democracy, multiracial universal suffrage, as happened in the 1990s, but he wanted to crack up the entire territory of South Africa into contractual communities, gated communities, in which you would have to pay for admission, and which white-dominated communities would live next to black-dominated communities. You would have a libertarian Bantustan next to a kind of a Maoist Bantustan. And his claim was this is a paradise of consumer freedom, vote with your feet, take the kind of world that you want to live in and choose it for yourself. But of course, in actuality, that would just reinforce and set more or less into legal stone the very racialized inequalities that apartheid was based on. So it's a kind of a wonderful version of sort of transforming the world to make it the same as it had been before, the kind of the leopard model, which suggests something to transcend apartheid, but is actually just a reconfiguration of it through a politics of crack up and fragmentation.
But the idea, the long run idea for them, is it every gated community and every Bantu stand for itself? And that would go against the free movement of capital because you want to block people, but you don't want to block capital. We'll get to goods later on. Or is it rationalized the way that you need the gated community to be well protected so that the wealth that it will produce will eventually trickle down to the world? How did they...
Yeah, there is no real sort of dream of trickle down, I would say. There is more a kind of resurrection, as I talk about in the book, quite literally, of the dream of the Middle Ages. So in the same way that Europe in the year 1000, which is a time and place that Hans Hermann Hoppe, one of my characters there, the heir of Murray Rothbard, will frequently refer to Europe in the year 1000 as a place you want to kind of get back to. What is it that attracts him about that? Well, Europe was a kind of shattered patchwork of many different jurisdictions, different kind of political arrangements, almost all hereditary, but some free cities, some sort of nascent versions of sort of merchant republics, but mostly duchies and princedoms and baronies and things like that. So you had, on the one hand, total political mishmash, chaos, but then you had a network of merchants who were able to move between all of those spaces and be sort of self-governed according to what was called the lex mercatoria, or the law merchant. So this vision of dividing and separating out sort of self-government in diverse fortified enclaves doesn't necessarily mean you're opting out of all the virtues of the free movement of goods or the division of labor even. It actually, ideally, combines sort of small-scale political self-government with total access to all of the fruits of the world through an itinerant merchant class, which then itself governs itself without the need of states. So they self-govern one to the other, protect contract, produce arbitration based on their own kind of professional code. So it's that duality which I think is a bit hard to grasp, but it works well if you think about it in terms of a Middle Ages model. Transposed to the 21st century, it becomes, annexed onto all of the new information and communication technologies which are available, which certainly give the fantasy of being able to be both totally isolated and yet totally plugged in to the world at the same time. So if you think about some of these people, especially in the Silicon Valley right, who live lives in which they are, sitting at a table or a desk and just with their phone, ordering everything they need and it just magically appears, that's a good model of how you can be kind of both separate but hyper-connected at the same time. And that's the sort of prototype, I think, that doesn't make any promises about the rising tide eventually lifting all boats, or there being some grand profit for the world's community in the long run. Those kind of utopian visions or promises have really vanished, I would say, from neoliberal rhetoric even. It's been reduced to a language of trying to get into the gated community so that you can protect yourself and your own, and creating a kind of profit center and insulating it from any attempts at seizure or redistribution by the useless surplus populations of the hinterland.
I understand, but you still would have two possible models. One model where only the people living in gated communities would be allowed to travel from Liechtenstein to Singapore and back, whereas the others wouldn't be able to travel. Or what you just said about Silicon Valley, where in fact you stay in your compound and you order things around, but that means then that, the brown people from Deliveroo are going to have to come and deliver the stuff, which kind of creates a danger for the gated community. So do they see it as we travel, they don't, or we don't need to travel because they bring
well,
stuff?
I think it's a combination of both, right? I mean, we don't exactly have to project ourselves into a world of cyberpunk fantasy to imagine what you're describing. I mean, much of the world is organized exactly on this principle of, places that are organized more or less as compounds, where private security is provided. There is a kind of underclass that provides all of the kind of maintenance of everyday life, whether it's guarding the premises, doing the gardens, taking care of the kids, washing the toilets, who are watched over and are ejected at the end of the day, or else live in, places inside of the compound themselves. One of the things that is often occluded from the fascination with, say, the Dubai model or the Singapore model is these are places where the majority of residents in those two small places are not citizens at all, have no rights of citizens, and can be, fired and deported at any time, whether they're the domestics, taking care of the kids, or the people building the office towers. The vision of kind of crack up capitalism that I developed there is totally reliant on a surplus pool of labor that can be brought in and ejected at any given time. The fact that you use the example of a delivery driver is great, because one of the kind of totems in crack up capitalism for me is Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, and his main protagonist in that is a pizza delivery person who sort of travels between jurisdictions. So this is the way that Stephenson introduces us to his sort of world-making process, is the pizza person going into, the apartheid gated community, and then from there to the small rump version of the United States, to the sort of techno metaverse community, and sort of traversing very quickly a high number of diverse sort of jurisdictions.